Hi everyone. So my group, we're kind of focusing on K through 12 education, specifically on education reform and how we can address issues that are set in place and maybe propose solutions that can fix it. So for my section, I'm kind of talking about like federal standards slash state standards, specifically focusing on Common Core and like how it's been integrated, how the outcomes are, and then in the end, I kind of propose a solution that could possibly be a middle ground. So let's start off with our problem. It doesn't necessarily start off in 2010, but that's kind of where we're going to start off with. In 2010, the US Department of Education produced a report that talks about the achievement gaps for 8th grade math in earning a level of proficient. So, for that achievement gap, about 12% of African Americans were able to earn proficient, and 17% of Hispanic students, whereas 44% of white students were able to earn that proficient level. So it's pretty like evident that there is a bit of an achievement gap, which is something I'm sure everyone kind of already instinctively knew. Um, and then in 2011, a study by the University of Southern California ranked the top countries in education. And the US, despite spending the largest amount of money on their education, scored fairly low in terms of math and science. So if you look at the chart that's on your right hand side, the bottom two sections where we are like the purpley plum color, that's us. So we're in like third and fourth place. We scored 26th overall out of 34 countries on the program for international student assessment, which is just like all um, industrial countries take this test, and we are pretty low on that. And so this became the catalyst for educational reform. So let's talk about Common Core. I don't know if you guys paid attention when Common Core became implemented. A lot of teachers did not like Common Core. And so it was created in 2010, and it was adopted in California and became like really implemented in 2014. So it took a couple years for like all the schools to get used to it and like figure out how to work with it. It was required in order for schools to earn massive federal grants. So, schools got money for implementing this. And it focused on math and English, including a smart balance standardized test. So I know everyone kind of knows like the pros and cons of standardized tests. They tried to recreate standardized tests in order to better fit Common Core, and so it's a little bit of a difference. We'll get into that a little bit later on. And then the purpose of Common Core was to emphasize critical thinking and class discussion. So they would outline what students should know by the end of each grade level, kind of like the objectives you get in the beginning of each year in college. And then they also talked about critical thinking skills so that it could help them attain jobs after they've graduated high school and college. And then schools and districts were able to set up curriculums in order to adhere to those standards, but it did ultimately have to get those expectations that the government has set. So next slide. So for this slide, it kind of just shows a little bit of what Common Core was trying to focus on, like life and career skills, and then information and media. And then it's got a couple questions that they used in order to center the goals that they create. Let's move on. Okay, so for the math standard, before Common Core, the math was set by the Faculty of Mathematics Department in 1997. And then after Common Core, it was divided into two sections. So it was subject content and then skill and techniques. And so it was meant to show students how to solve problems and so that they have a better understanding of how it works. So rather than just teaching formulas, it was teaching different techniques for solving those problems. For the English standard, before Common Core, it stressed a lot of fiction work, and it was a lot of like critical writing and analyzing, like literature and things like that. And then after Common Core, it was a focus on nonfiction work and using evidence to support your reasoning because they felt like that will instill better skills for everyday life than just reading fiction work. So the success of Common Core. So I think a lot of times when you hear Common Core, you kind of hear that it wasn't successful or that teachers don't like it, things like that. but there is some successes for it. So there are quite a few schools that did benefit from the introduction of Common Core. It's mostly districts. I mean, not schools. I'm sorry about that. They're labeled up on this graph in the blue section. We're gonna focus on Chula Vista for this video. So Chula Vista, their math and reading scores risen by a double-digit percentage, which doesn't necessarily sound like a lot when you're specifically looking at that graph. But in terms of overall schools getting better, that's a pretty high amount. They focused it, they attributed the success to interdependence, which is kind of them working together. So principals set goals, principal supervisors would offer recommendations, and then they would talk to teachers, and then the districts would provide coaching for everyone who needed it, especially like principals, in order for them to best implement these things because their focus was students first. So while a lot of schools kind of pushed back on regulations and they didn't necessarily like it, the schools that had the highest success kind of took these regulations and did their best to change the way that their system worked in order to fit those new standards. And then let's obviously go over issues with Common Core. That's kind of what everyone has, or like these issues with them. William M. Evers and then Zeev Werman, they wrote this piece as kind of, it was titled like The Mistake of Common Core. And they were basically talking about how this leads to underdeveloped math skills rather than more developed math skills, and it pushed Algebra 1 into high school rather than introducing it earlier like it was supposed to do. And then because of this, we had a drop in diversity for those classes. A lot of Latino and African American students, they suffered from this because they weren't able to meet with the new requirements and they kind of got left behind. And then in terms of college and career readiness, only about 44% of graduating seniors felt like they were ready for either college or a career after, which is a fairly low amount. You know, you would hope that the point of Common Core was to make you ready for the future. So if only 44% are actually ready, then it's missing the mark. And then in terms of like that 44%, those who are considered high need are even lower. English learners were only at 16.8%, foster youth were at 13.3%, and students with disabilities were only at 10.8%. Um, so the Public Policy Institute of California, they kind of talked about how testing scores are improving, especially for that earlier talked about PISA test. Those scores, we have earned a little bit higher of scores, but that kind of doesn't necessarily fix the disparities that exist within high need students. So California's concessions for students, so we're coming back to the Smart Balanced exam. Those are tests that were meant to become more, they were supposed to show more than the like report card style standardized tests that you may have gotten earlier. So now it's supposed to have more detail in like the weaknesses and the strengths of the student. And so for those, it was supposed to allow students to be able to see how they can do better or where they're failing, and make it easier for them. And then at the same time, they're trying to offer um, make it more available, I'm sorry, for high need students. So like students who may not speak English, they have like a Spanish version of it, and then students with disabilities, they have the California Alternative Assessment. And out of those ones, 51% of students who took the exam successfully mastered reading, and 40% earned a passing grade in math. So that's at least it's like halfway there. Like I said, it may not be the highest amount, but also it's only been a couple years since it's been instituted. I mean, 10 years isn't a whole lot when the original ones were from like the 1990s. So they're trying their best right now, and we see that there are still a lot of issues. But like I said, some schools have had success. So it's not necessarily that this is a lost cause, but rather what can we do to fix it, and like how can schools work with it. So let's talk about other countries that have been able to actively, I'm sorry, that have been able to do well in the PISA test and then also have a low disparities between their students, and that's Canada. Since the beginning of the PISA test, Canada has one of the strongest records of it. They ranked second in reading and ninth in math. And again, that's out of 30 something amount of students. So that's really high up. And then that's attributed to the fact that there's no like federal regulations. Instead, each province and territory kind of decides what regulations they're going to set in place for their people. So they're better able to meet the goals of students because instead of trying to make overarching goals, they're making goals that are specific to a smaller group of people. So overall, like I said, we're kind of focusing on what are the issues that are already set in place. And I think the biggest issue is the Common Core, but it's not necessarily exactly how Common Core is run. It's kind of just the fact that there are federally regulated Common Core, and so it makes it difficult for schools and districts and states just overall to meet those needs while also addressing the needs of their citizens and their students. So I think like I said, the biggest issue is maybe moving it from federal to state. But just overall, like the standards set in place, they're not lost causes. It just needs to be looked at in a different light. And the catalyst for causing these things, such as the our low ranking internationally, it when taking considering it, it's not necessarily as much of an issue where we place internationally, whereas it's in terms of, I'm sorry, it's not as much of an issue where we place internationally when you're looking at the students who are living in this country and they're not able to get their own needs met. So that's why our whole group again is calling for educational reform again, taking a look at the way that we have structured our education within the last 10 years and trying to figure out ways that we can fix it so that we can move forward and more focus on the disparities of high need students rather than our placement internationally.